Hello, and welcome to our unit on colonial women. Much of the presentation I'm going to make today was taken from a book by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. The book was called Good Wives, Image and Reality in the Lives of Women in New England, 1650 to 1750. That tells you we're covering about a 100-year colonial period from the time of settlement through the time just before the Revolutionary War. Her work particularly focused on New England, but we're going to try to apply what she has to say to a variety of women. Because we're covering 100 years of women's history, we're going to engage in some pretty broad generalizations. There are going to be great differences between the experiences of the very first colonial women who arrive in a place like the Chesapeake, where there are very few women to go around and 40% of people are dying from disease, and from women in the 1740s who might be living in a much more settled, almost revolutionary area. Nonetheless, this is a period of time that we can say some broad general things about women's experience that would be true of the majority of women in the period, from the age of early settlement to the Revolution. I want to remind you that during this time there were lots of political upheavals and religious conflicts. There were 4 major wars, so we're talking about the First Great Awakening, wars like the French and Indian War that certainly affected people for short periods of time. But rather than focusing on those, we're going to focus on broad shared themes and experiences. You want to remember that the colonial world was not at all like our own world. The colonial world, people often thought in very formulaic abstractions that were the goal. That is, there was an idea of an ideal woman. And the hope was that everyone would aspire to be that. Our current contemporary focus on individualism and everyone being themselves was simply not the case in the colonial world. An ideal woman should be holy, prayerful, watchful, zealous, prudent, sincere, humble, meek, patient, self-denying, public-spirited, diligent, faithful, and charitable. What does that mean? Well, to me it sounds like she was expected to be a saint. She was certainly religious, she was quiet, she was self-denying, and she also was looking out for others. It's almost certain that a colonial woman was a wife. Almost all females who reached the age of maturity married. Unlike in Europe, where about 10% of women during this period remained single, there was no place in the colonial Americas for a single woman. So women married, and if widowed, they remarried. American women married younger than their European counterparts. They were younger than their husbands in almost all cases. They married somewhere between 18 and 20-something. They weren't child brides. They weren't marrying 14 or 15 like some people might imagine, but they were marrying at a time that we would consider today to be quite youthful. There's no question the colonial woman was obedient. There were religious as well as legal requirements for her to be so. Obedience to one's husband, to one's master, were included in the Bible. There were also issues in English common law that made the husband and wife one person. Once you got married, you became part of your husband. And for that reason, women could not hold property independently or testify in court or enter on a contract or write a will. If you're one person, you can only have one will, one contract, one vote. We see this idea, this English law idea, in the loss of name. Women went from being Mary Brown, not even to being Mrs. John Brown, but to being John Brown, his wife. The name acknowledged the husband and suggested that you were a connected person. You were the wife of John Brown. It's interesting if we look at widowhood, women who were married but whose husbands died. because we see in those cases, especially in wills, that women were often maintained, but they seldom retained in control or remained in control of their property and goods. At best, they had that control until their sons came of age and took over. The presumption was households would be male-headed. We want to be careful, though, not to judge these women in our own terms. The colonial world was a very hierarchical one. A child was obedient to a parent, a master to a servant, and a subject to a ruler, to the king. Many people, in fact, considered men and women to have parity, that is, equality. Not that men and women were the same, but instead that they were complementary, that they each had their own strengths and they helped each other. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich talks about women in terms of a set of roles, not so much as we will in more modern times talk about women in a separate sphere, but rather the idea that women wore many hats, and those hats shaped her life. On the screen you see a list of those most common roles that we're going to be looking for evidence of as we read A Midwife's Tale and read the story of Martha Ballard, a colonial to Revolutionary era woman. Women were housewife. The house as a space, meaning the house and yard, defined their life. It's where they lived and did their work. Their tasks were also household focused: cooking, washing, sewing, milking, spinning, cleaning, gardening, the list goes on. You'll see a brief video clip of colonial women at work and see what hard work it was. Housewife also limited the area of women's authority. They were in charge of the internal economy of the family, the things within the house, not the external. Deputy husband was another important role. This was the idea that women were kind of second in command, that they should shoulder male duties, be a helper to their husband, so a farmer's wife would plant or a weaver's wife would wind quills. Not just a helper, but also a surrogate if the time required. If a man went off to war or was sick, his wife not only could, but must replace him. This meant that women could do male roles if called upon, and in fact were expected to do so, but only in the absence of a husband. Women were also consorts. They were the supporters and the sexual partners of their husband, expected to strike a balance between being religious and modest and being sexual in a serving role. Women were mothers. This was a biological role, but it was also a social role, a role that gave them power over children's education. Women were mistresses, not in maybe the sense you're thinking, but in the sense of being in charge, of training and supervising, feeding and clothing those who worked for them. Those could be slaves, indentured servants, or even one's own children as they got older. You would be the mistress of your household, assigning duties to your daughters, training them to be housewives, feeding, clothing, and supervising them. Women had a very important role as neighbor. This was a social role in the larger community where women watched out for others. They helped in childbirth. They might offer charity to those less off from them. They might keep an eye on the community to make sure that people weren't going astray. Of course, colonial women were Christians. With few exceptions, colonial people were members of a Christian church. The Christian view was that women were spiritually equal, but they were silent and powerless in most churches. With the exception of Quaker women who could preach, positions of authority in the church were held for males. Sometimes, occasionally, women were also heroines. They stepped outside the bounds of their normal life to do something truly heroic. This was true of women who were captured by Native Americans or women who stepped up and fought during a war. Now, I have to remind you, caution you really, that there's a difference between the ideal and the real. Women often did things that by law or custom they were not allowed to do. The nature of frontier life, living out on the outskirts of society, was that people were often required to do things outside the norm. I also want to remind you that the home was the center of the colonial world. So if the woman was in charge of the home and the home was the center, this gave her a lot of power. If money was made, it was often made, as far as cash, by women who sold cheese or eggs or some product for extra cash. Everyone worked. Men and women on farms worked at home, and work was not defined by wages, it was defined by task. After you listen to this presentation, you're going to go on to read A Midwife's Tale, the story of a woman, Martha Ballard, who lived in rural Maine from 1785 to 1812. If you notice those dates, they're a bit later than the period we're talking about, but because she lived on the frontier, I would argue, she represents very much colonial women. And we choose this book because there are so few diaries that exist from the colonial period to tell us a great deal about women's lives. As you read it, I hope you'll think about how she fits into the women's roles that this presentation has suggested. Are there evidences of her being a neighbor, of being a wife, a mother, and a mistress? You'll also notice that this narrative, this writing by Martha Ballard, is full of references to God, which ties her clearly to her Puritan ancestors during the colonial era. They're full of references to nature. She lived on the frontier, and the weather and the world going on around her impacted her daily life. There's lots of repetition. Her life was seldom thrilling. It was not marked by major political events. It was often marked by the same event, washing or gardening or even helping in childbirth again and again. There's also, though, a focus on education. Martha Ballard was unusual in that she was literate. She was a mother of 9, but she also could read and write, and she had medical experience and therefore practiced a profession. We might then have to think about how she fit standard women's roles and how she was, in some ways, unique.